Na ora sa tahayu yawete. I'm glad that you decided to tune in for episode number 33 in the tutorial series of the Ælis language. Today, I'd like to shine a light on something I've said I'd discuss in a future episode. In video 30, we spoke about the root word classes. Today's episode will hone in specifically on class 5. Then, in the previous video about one-word sentences, I gave an example sentence where the partition marker yi could be considered to be a part of the partition rather than being a partition marker itself, due to a phenomenon called partition marker ranking. So if you haven't seen videos 30 and 32 yet, I highly recommend you do that first. Well, today is the day. Partition marker ranking. Let's go. As a reminder, there are 8 root words of class 5, 8 so-called partition markers. The characteristic marker, M, the referent marker, vai, the origin marker, li, the activity marker, lo, the passivity marker, io, the exclamation marker, sa, the question marker, ne, and the target marker, yi. Apart from being class 5 root words, these particles have an additional attribute called a rank. Given that I've been overloading you with grammatical terms and numbered categories lately, root word classes 1 through 6 and morphosyntactic levels 1 through 6, now you might be thinking, oh god, now you're going to bury me with another numbered list I have to memorize? That's fair. So let's get to the question why. Why do we need this? Well, allow me to make 2 remarks. Firstly, the partition marker ranking system may seem intimidating and difficult, but I like to believe it's not that hard, especially once you understand where it's coming from. Secondly, and I'm being totally honest with you, I didn't initially come up or even want to come up with the partition marker ranking system. It only came to fruition after I realized one day that there were some unresolved ambiguities in the Ælis grammar that, in order to be resolved, would make me have to take quite some steps back and rethink a significant part of the grammar. By the time I realized this, however, I felt like the language had already progressed too much, and I was already using it the way I was, to an extent in which it didn't seem viable to undo such a big chunk of its grammar. So, an alternative solution was to try and devise a way of backing up this aspect of the language's behavior with an additional grammatical rule set. I repeat, it's a quirk I didn't initially foresee, but I guess it just worked out that way. Kind of like irregular verbs in natural languages, perhaps. But, as I said, I think I can convince you that it kind of isn't that hard to follow once you understand where the partition marker ranking mechanic came from. So, why? What's going on? Well, the problem lies in the versatility of the partition markers, notably these 4. We discussed them in video 19. They have a bunch of meanings. Though all related to the same core idea, these meanings are not always without ambiguity. I kind of already illustrated this in video 29, where I told you that the word yieo could be interpreted to mean both birth and death. We resolved this issue by flipping the root word order, but that trick won't always work, unfortunately. So let's work with a new example. What's the problem exactly? Have a look at these 4 particles. Ma means man or male, lo means activity or active, yi means target or goal, and eira means smart or intelligent. Now, in video 29, I explained how yi can be prefixed to a word in order to express change or transition. So eira is to bring towards intelligence. If you bring yourself towards intelligence, then it means to learn. If you bring others towards intelligence, then that translates to teach. The word eira in itself can mean both. Then, again in video 19, I told you that you can prefix lo to a word in order to turn it into an active or transitive verb, and that resolves the ambiguity about whether we're talking about teaching or learning in this case. The learner is on the receiving end of education. A teacher is at the sending or transmitting end of it, and therefore, lo eira means to teach and not to learn, right? Finally, a teaching man is a male teacher. Therefore, malo eira, teacher. Now, let's look at the same 4 components and highlight 2 other particles first. One of the core principles of the Ælis morphology states that two ordinary root words in combination behave like noun and adjective, from left to right. So in this example, the meaning of ma can be seen as a noun, and lo can be seen as its adjective. Consequently, ma lo is an active man. This man has a goal, he has a purpose. His activities have a purpose. It's a purposefully active man. And his purpose is intelligence. He is active with the purpose of reaching intelligence. He's an engaged or industrious student. So, ma lo ji e ira, engaged student, right? But it gets worse. Let's look at the particles again and reinterpret them. In video 19, I told you that you can put lo between two parts of a word to indicate that the first is actively engaged in the second. And a man that's engaged in goals or targets is a man that works towards reaching goals. It's an entrepreneur. Not just any entrepreneur, but a smart one at that. So what does ma lo ji e ira mean? Is it a teacher, an industrious student, or a smart visionary? Now we could get all romantically philosophical about it and argue that a smart entrepreneur is someone that goes to the school of life and is a lifelong engaged student, as well as someone open in sharing their knowledge with the world, teaching them how to become successful like themselves. But let's not kid ourselves here. For all practical purposes, these words just describe three different types of people. So which one is it? The teacher, the student, or the entrepreneur? This kind of ambiguity answers the question of why we need a solution, and this brings us to the question of what. What is a partition marker rank? Well, let's bring back the partition markers. So, this time we'll rearrange them into columns. The characteristic marker has rank 1. The referent, activity, and passivity markers have rank 2. The question and exclamation markers have rank 3. And the target and origin markers are rank 4. These ranks go from high to low, meaning that rank 1 is the highest and rank 4 is the lowest. Not only that, but the partition markers themselves run from grammatical to semantical. This means that yi and li are the most useful of the partition markers to help create vocabulary with. I illustrated this in video 29 called Powerhouses of the Lexicon. The characteristic marker, with rank 1 on the other hand, doesn't have any semantic value. The sole purpose of its existence is grammatical, to split a word into partitions and mark the latter partition as an adjective or adverb of the former. Now, a word of consolation. Usually the ranks that partition markers have are not important. So when do they matter? Let's look at our previous example word again. The ranks of the partition markers are only relevant whenever we have two partition markers in a row within one and the same word. This is the case here. We have the activity marker lo followed directly by the target marker yi. Now, lo outranks yi because the former is of rank 2 and the latter is of rank 4. Because of this, lo will become the true partition marker. Yi decays into a part of the second partition. The particle with the highest rank will assume the grammatical function of partition marker, while the one with the lowest rank will be used for its semantic value as part of the partition. Now that we know this, we also know how to interpret the example word, man that does education, man that sends, engages in, performs, or is active in education, and that is a teacher. So, ma lo ji e ira is a teacher and nothing else. So how do we say student then? Well, we can exchange the activity marker for the passivity marker io. Io has the same rank, so the structure of our compound word stays the same. Man that gets, man that undergoes education, man that is subjected to or the target of education, man passive in education. Okay? That leaves only the last word. How can we express this in an unambiguous way? That brings us to the question of how we can manipulate this ranking system to our advantage. For this, we'll look at the grid again. Alone at the top, M is the only rank 1 marker, outranking every other particle. In practice, This means that you can use M freely as a tool to create partitions wherever you like. You put M between any two root words of any given word in order to group both the preceding and succeeding string. Use this trick to your advantage whenever you want to resolve any structural issues like the ones we've encountered. And that's what we'll do here as well. In order to get the desired outcome, we'll want the partitions to be split like this. So we'll take them apart, put the characteristic marker in between, and glue the word back together. And there we have it, a smart entrepreneur. With the newly acquired knowledge of partition marker ranks, we can now distinguish three words from one another, while we previously didn't know what the word in question meant. So if two partition markers of a different rank become neighbors within the same word, then the higher rank will split the word into partitions, and the lower rank will arrange itself within the partition. In this example, vai outranks yi. So this is the structure of our word. Na ira vai yi itai means good compared to turning green, or in proper English, better than turning green, or better than turning it green. But what happens if two partition markers of the same rank meet each other? In this example, we have li and yi side by side. Both belong to rank 4. Will the former decay into a lexeme and the latter split the partitions? Or will it be the other way around? Well, technically, it could be either, but there's only one way it makes semantical sense, and that's option number 3. They both belong to a partition. In order for us to make that unambiguously clear, we take them apart and perform the same characteristic trick again. Plop! And there we go. Now we get lo de yi on one hand, which means the last job, and li ini on the other, done by her. In proper English, lo de ji em li ini means the last job that she'll do, or the last job that she's done, depending on the time frame of the surrounding sentences. In summary, the rank that partition markers carry is only relevant when two partition markers end up side by side within the same word. The highest rank will become the partition marker. The lowest rank will be used for its semantical value, as an ordinary root word within the partition. But if you found this video confusing, the only thing you really need to take away from it is this. In practice, every situation where the partition marker rank matters usually involves these two rascals. If they bump into other partition markers, they'll cease their partition marking ability and turn into ordinary root words. It's not even important that you know the exact ranks of the other elements, because in practice, it'll hardly ever be relevant. Just remember that whenever it's unclear whether li or yi are grammatical dividers or used for their meaning, then you can use M to chop up the compound word in a way that you see fit. And that's that. I hope I haven't scared you off. If you're still interested in finding out more about Ælis, stick around. There's plenty of stuff to come. Consider subscribing. Ya aima hagi ora em arwete lo en, em gayi e irata em eg Ælis ta ji waite. Ha eleana ira asta ira, emen em wete lo en ji an waite. Ta ya wete, hanaina orasa.